September 4th, 1925, 3:17 a.m. Sandy Point Farm, Rhode Island. As the rain washes the last grains of summer from the windows, it is not just a man dying in this gilded chamber. It is the end of an empire built on steel and steam, now dissolving in whiskey and regret. The storm batters the Newport coastline with biblical intensity, each thunderclap marking the final moments of a dynasty that once seemed as permanent as the granite foundations beneath this very mansion. Lightning illuminates the scene in harsh sepia flashes, silk draperies imported from Lyon hanging heavy with moisture, Italian marble floors veined like arteries, gold-leafed mirrors reflecting nothing but shadows between the bursts of white light, as if even illumination has abandoned this place. Of reckoning. The bedroom is a monument to wealth that no longer exists, every object a testament to money spent rather than invested, consumed rather than preserved. On the mahogany nightstand sits a crystal glass of champagne, its bubbles long since surrendered to gravity and time, flat, lifeless, a perfect metaphor for the man whose lips last touched its rim. The champagne cost more per bottle than most American families earned in a month, yet now sits abandoned, evaporating slowly into the humid air of this death chamber. Racing forms scatter across the Persian carpet like fallen autumn leaves, their pages marked with the careful notations of a man who believed he could predict the future through bloodlines and track conditions. Tomorrow's card from Belmont Park lies closest to the bed, horses' names circled in fountain pen ink, bets he will never place, races he will never see, the final entries in a ledger of wagers that consumed a fortune and returned only emptiness. The ornate clock dominates the room with its relentless precision, each tick marking another second closer to the inevitable conclusion, each talk a reminder that time, unlike creditors, cannot be negotiated with or postponed. In the bed, barely visible between lightning strikes, lies the silhouette of Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, heir to what was arguably America's largest private fortune, his breathing a wet, rattling struggle against mortality itself. Each breath carries the wheeze of a liver destroyed by 2 decades of the finest whiskeys money could buy, the sound of a biological system shutting down with mechanical inevitability. The silk bedsheets, custom made in Belgium and embroidered with the Vanderbilt crest, are damp with the sweat of a man who treated his body not as a temple, but as another expendable resource to be consumed in pursuit of sensation. The cruel mathematics of destruction hang in the air like the storm itself, undeniable and devastating. 10 years earlier, when his father's estate was finally settled, Reginald inherited $70 million, wealth that defied ordinary comprehension, enough to live like an emperor for 1,000 lifetimes, enough to endow universities or build entire cities from nothing. Tonight, as his life ebbs away with each struggling breath, his estate contains less than $1 million. In the hallway outside this dying man's chamber, creditors have already begun to gather like vultures sensing carrion on the wind, lawyers and representatives of banks, bookmakers, and jewelers who funded a decade of impossible excess. They wait with the patient stillness of men who know their claims are legitimate and their victory inevitable, consulting pocket watches and speaking in hushed tones about promissory notes and gambling debts that must be settled before the body is even cold. The sensory details paint a portrait of dissolution more eloquent than any financial statement. The soft, rhythmic thud of rain against leaded glass creates percussion that sounds almost like applause, as if the storm itself is acknowledging the performance of a lifetime, the spectacular destruction of a dynasty through nothing more dramatic than sustained, methodical self-indulgence. The rustle of silk accompanies each labored movement, a whisper of luxury that has become indistinguishable from suffering. On the nightstand, positioned as if in deliberate mockery, sits tomorrow's racing form, marked with calculations and odds for horses that will run without him, a perfect encapsulation of his life's philosophy, always planning the next bet, never understanding that the house always wins and time always collects its debts. The irony cuts deeper than any physical pain he might be experiencing in these final moments. In the nursery at the far end of this vast, emptying mansion, his 18-month-old daughter Gloria sleeps peacefully in a crib hand carved by Italian craftsmen, unaware that she has inherited not a dynasty but a debt, not security but scandal, not the American dream but its most public nightmare. The trust fund established for her protection, $2.5 million carefully shielded from her father's creditors, represents all that remains of the $70 million he inherited, the final fragment of an empire that took 3 generations to build and 1 generation to destroy. She sleeps under blankets softer than anything most children will ever touch, yet she will become the poor little rich girl, the contested prize in the most scandalous custody battle in American history. The Vanderbilt name, once synonymous with American royalty, with the triumph of capitalism and the unassailable power of the Gilded Age, now whispers a different truth in this rain-soaked chamber of death. It speaks of mortality, not just of flesh, but of fortunes themselves, testifying that even the mightiest dynasties are mortal, that wealth without discipline is merely fuel for a spectacular fire, that surnames carry no protection against the mathematical consequences of sustained foolishness. The lightning that illuminates this room reveals not just a dying man, but the death of an idea, the fantasy that some families were simply too wealthy to fail, that some fortunes were too vast to squander, that American aristocracy could sustain itself through inheritance alone. As the final breath escapes his lips, a long, rattling exhalation that seems to carry with it not just air, but the last remnants of a dynasty, the silence is absolute. The man is gone, his suffering concluded. But the question that will haunt American society for generations hangs in the rain-soaked air like an accusation. He was born into a world where his name could purchase kingdoms, where his signature commanded instant respect, where doors opened and obstacles dissolved simply because he bore the surname Vanderbilt. Yet as the storm continues its indifferent percussion against the glass, one mystery demands an answer. How do you transform $70 million into a cautionary tale in just 10 short years? The answer lies not in this dying room, but in the golden years before the rot set in, back when the Vanderbilt name meant something other than tragedy, and in the fatal, glittering flaw that was hiding in the gold from the very beginning. January 14, 1880. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt entered the world not in a hospital, but in a Fifth Avenue palace that occupied an entire city block. He was born into what newspapers called American royalty, the living proof that in the New World, dynasties could be forged from iron rails and industrial fire. The mansion where he drew his first breath contained more marble than most cathedrals, more gilt than European palaces, and more servants than some villages could claim as total population. This was not merely wealth. This was the transformation of American commerce into something approaching monarchy, complete with its own codes, rituals, and unspoken laws of succession. By the time Reginald's infant eyes opened to the world, the Vanderbilt family controlled an estimated 10% of all currency in circulation in the United States. To comprehend this concentration of wealth requires understanding that one family, through sheer ruthlessness and industrial vision, had captured a tenth of America's entire monetary supply. The fortune began with his great-grandfather, Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, a hard-eyed ferryman from Staten Island who started with a single boat and built an empire through methods that would make modern robber barons seem genteel by comparison. The Commodore understood something fundamental about the emerging American economy. Whoever controlled transportation controlled everything else. He worked 14-hour days into his 70s, his mind running on timetables and tariffs, not perfumes and cotillions. First came steamships, dominating the waterways between New York and expanding territories. Then railroads, and with them, the true explosion of Vanderbilt power. He squeezed competitors until they sold at devastating losses, bribed legislators with casual efficiency, and built his empire on the principle that sentiment was the enemy of prosperity. When he died in 1877, just 3 years before Reginald's birth, he left behind nearly $100 million, the largest personal fortune ever accumulated in American history to that point. But Reginald was born into a fundamentally different world than his great-grandfather had conquered. Where the Commodore had seen tracts and timetables, Reginald's father, Cornelius II, saw fades and frescoes. The family had evolved beyond mere accumulation into what could only be called the ornamental phase of their dynasty. The age of building wealth had given way to the age of displaying it. Cornelius II constructed the Breakers in Newport, a 70-room cottage requiring a permanent staff of 40 just to maintain, and solidified the family's position as American aristocracy. Every doorknob was custom designed, every ceiling hand painted by European masters, every marble column quarried specifically for rooms that would host perhaps a dozen formal dinners each summer season. This was the ecosystem that shaped Reginald's consciousness. His childhood unfolded in spaces designed to overwhelm, ballrooms where a single evening's entertainment cost more than most American families earned in 5 years. Libraries containing first editions that servants dusted with brushes softer than silk, stables housing horses whose bloodlines were tracked with more care than human genealogies. The brutal mechanics that had created this dynasty, the underpaid laborers, the crushed competitors, the ruthless consolidations, were politely buried beneath velvet and etiquette. His education reflected this ornamental existence with devastating precision. While his great-grandfather had educated himself through necessity and cunning, Reginald was tutored by specialists imported from Europe's finest institutions. He learned French from Parisian instructors who corrected his pronunciation with the precision of jewelers cutting diamonds. He learned sailing from professional yachtsmen who had competed in international regattas. He mastered the elaborate codes of formal dining, the proper way to address European nobility, the subtle distinctions between morning coats and afternoon attire. What he did not learn, what no one thought to teach him, was the actual mechanics of wealth creation, the discipline of capital preservation, or even the simple mathematics of living within means, however generous. The tragedy embedded in this privilege was that Reginald was the spare to his older brother Alfred's heir. In aristocratic systems, the heir receives the burden of responsibility alongside the privilege. Alfred was taken into boardrooms, shown ledgers, taught the grim necessities of business. Reginald was left in ballrooms. He was given the checkbook without the ledger, luxury without labor, power without purpose. He became a soft creature bred in captivity, utterly unequipped to survive in the wild, yet armed with enough resources to purchase a small kingdom. The Vanderbilt calendar dictated existence with the regularity of seasons, creating a world where money was not earned, but simply existed, like air itself. Winters were spent in the Fifth Avenue mansion, hosting elaborate dinners for New York's elite, attending opera performances in private boxes, maintaining the social machinery that kept American aristocracy functioning. Spring brought the migration of entire households, servants, silver, wardrobes, horses, to Newport. Summer in Newport was not leisure but performance, an endless succession of formal dinners, yacht races, tennis tournaments, and elaborate costume balls where guests spent thousands on single evenings attire. Autumn meant returns to the city, the careful maintenance of alliances and hierarchies that determined who mattered in American society. Reginald grew to adolescence without ever handling currency, without understanding that meals appearing before him required not just preparation but payment, that the horses he rode for pleasure consumed thousands annually in care and feeding, that his very clothes represented expenditures that would have sustained working families for months. The fortune was not his to manage, but simply his to inhabit, a vast and seemingly inexhaustible resource that required nothing from him except that he exist as its living embodiment. But beneath the gilt and marble, a more fundamental and dangerous transformation had occurred. The Commodore's fortune was built on productive assets, railroads that moved goods, steamships that transported passengers, investments that yielded returns. By Reginald's generation, much of that capital had been converted into monuments, mansions that consumed rather than generated wealth, art collections that appreciated but produced no income, social positions that required constant expenditure to maintain. The empire had been transformed from an engine of creation into a temple of consumption. More devastating still was the psychological impact of this transformation. In a life where every outcome was guaranteed, where failure was impossible because his safety net was woven from solid gold, Reginald began to crave the one thing his money couldn't buy: uncertainty. He needed a place where his name didn't guarantee the result, where he could feel the terrifying, exhilarating rush of genuine risk. Without the natural resistance of life, he never developed the muscles of restraint or judgment. He was a boat without a rudder, drifting on a sea of infinite possibility, desperately seeking something, anything, that could make him feel truly alive. As he entered his 20s, looking out over the Atlantic from the marble terraces of the breakers, Reginald was a man hollowed out by excess. He possessed the finest education money could buy, yet had no profession. He bore the most powerful name in America, yet had no identity of his own. The world saw a prince of industry, a young god of the new American century. But looking past the starched collar and perfectly tailored morning coat, one could see the vacancy in his eyes, the look of a man waiting for something to happen, desperate for a spark to ignite the dry tinder of his idle days. The empire his grandfather built ran on discipline and calculation, on the understanding that wealth was a tool to be wielded with surgical precision. But the heir to this precision would soon discover his true calling lay in the only realm where control is pure illusion, the turn of a card, the thunder of hooves, and the bottom of a glass. At 21, when most heirs receive a modest allowance and stern lectures about fiscal responsibility, Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt was handed the keys to financial infinity. The date was January 14, 1901, his 21st birthday, and the documents were signed in the mahogany-paneled offices of the family's attorneys on Lower Broadway. His signature, practiced and elegant, transferred control of $15.5 million, nearly $500 million in today's currency. But wealth without purpose is merely fuel waiting for a spark, and Reginald, walking into the winter afternoon air of Manhattan, was already holding the match. The tragedy of this inheritance was not its magnitude, but its timing. Reginald came into his fortune precisely as the Gilded Age was curdling into something more decadent and less disciplined. The industrious spirit that had driven his great-grandfather, the Commodore, through 14-hour workdays had completely evaporated from the family ethos. In its place had emerged a culture of competitive leisure, where wealthy young men measured their worth not in enterprises built, but in pleasures consumed. For a man with no profession, no ambition, and infinite resources, the world offered a terrifying abundance of empty hours that demanded to be filled with sensation. Reginald's fatal flaw was not greed. Greed implies hunger for acquisition, the desire to accumulate and build. Reginald had no need to acquire. He already owned everything imaginable. His affliction was far more insidious: terminal boredom. In a life where every detail was choreographed by others, meals planned by master chefs, clothes selected by personal valets, social engagements arranged by his mother, gambling offered the intoxicating illusion of personal agency. At the card table or racetrack, for the first time in his pampered existence, outcomes were not predetermined by his surname. The dice showed no deference to Vanderbilt blood. The roulette wheel spun without regard for his pedigree. In this democracy of chance, he discovered a strange and ultimately fatal form of freedom. The contrast with his older brother Alfred was stark and telling. Alfred had been groomed from childhood to shoulder the burden of empire, sitting in boardrooms, reviewing railroad operations, learning the brutal mathematics of maintaining industrial dominance. He understood that the Vanderbilt fortune was not a static monument, but a living organism requiring constant attention and occasionally ruthless decisions. But Reginald, as the spare, was purely ornamental. He was the human equivalent of the gilt-edged mirrors adorning the breakers, expensive, impressive, and ultimately reflective rather than substantive. This lack of purpose created a vacuum in his soul that demanded to be filled with noise, adrenaline, and the electric thrill of risk. His descent began with an air of respectability that made it all the more dangerous. Horse breeding and racing were not merely acceptable pursuits for American aristocracy, they were practically mandatory. The sport of kings allowed wealthy men to demonstrate refinement, understanding of bloodlines, and connection to ancient European traditions of nobility. Reginald threw himself into this world with the fervor of a man who had finally found something resembling purpose. He purchased Sandy Point Farm in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, transforming it into one of the most elaborate breeding operations on the eastern seaboard, complete with stables housing over 100 thoroughbreds. But the psychology behind his involvement revealed itself almost immediately to those paying attention. Reginald was not building a sustainable racing enterprise based on careful analysis of bloodlines and market conditions. He was chasing sensation. He purchased horses on impulse, paying absurd premiums for animals that caught his fancy, then losing interest within weeks. The operation consumed hundreds of thousands annually in feed, training, veterinary care, and specialized staff before a single race was run. What captivated him was not the breeding charts or bloodline discussions, but the moment the starting gates flew open and horses surged forward in a blur of muscle and velocity, those seconds where nothing could be altered, where money and preparation dissolved into the pure, ungovernable chaos of chance. The first significant victory was transcendent. Surrounded by friends in the paddock at Belmont Park, emboldened by youth and champagne, he had placed a wager that would have startled ordinary men but represented merely a rounding error in his mental arithmetic. When his horse won by 3 lengths, the payout was spectacular, but the money barely registered in his consciousness. What marked him permanently was the sensation itself, the surge of adrenaline as they turned into the final stretch, the racing of his own pulse in counterpoint to pounding hooves, the fractional second when uncertainty collapsed into triumph. In that moment, something inside him clicked into place. It felt, he later confided to a friend, like the universe was briefly arranged in my favor. But the architecture of addiction is never built from victories alone. The first serious loss came with the inevitability of dusk following afternoon. Another race, another confident prediction buoyed by previous success, another betting slip representing not just idle funds, but his supposed mastery over fate. This time, his entry stumbled at the turn, finishing far back in the field, swallowed by the merciless mathematics of probability. The money vanished, but what marked him that day was not the sense of deprivation. He still possessed more wealth than he could physically spend in a decade, but the sharp, bitter jolt of loss cutting through his habitual comfort like a blade. And then, almost immediately, came the urge to erase that feeling, to rewrite the story's ending, to make the universe tilt back in his direction. Chasing the loss felt almost as intoxicating as the original win. Friends began to notice what they delicately termed his fondness for chance. At first, their observations carried tones of indulgent amusement. He was, after all, the Vanderbilt boy, too rich to be ruined, too charming to be criticized. But as the sums crept higher, their language shifted almost imperceptibly. "He does like a bit of action," one remarked. "Needs excitement," said another. "Has a craving for action that seems to consume him from within," noted a third in his private diary. Beneath these euphemisms lay the first faint foreshadowing of disaster, subtle, deniable, yet unmistakable to anyone familiar with the anatomy of compulsion. The respectable veneer of horse racing soon proved insufficient to satisfy his escalating need for risk. Reginald discovered the private gaming rooms tucked away in Manhattan's most exclusive gentlemen's clubs, the Metropolitan, the Union, the Knickerbocker. Officially, these institutions existed for conversation, brandy, politics, and social architecture. Unofficially, they functioned as sanctuaries where wealthy men could shed their public masks and embrace forbidden appetites with mutual discretion. The public lounges displayed mahogany panels and oil paintings. The private rooms revealed the true currency of this class, risk itself. Within these windowless sanctuaries, gambling flourished in a haze of cigar smoke and plausible deniability. The tables were upholstered in green felt, edges worn smooth by countless fingers. Ivory chips clicked together in rhythms as hypnotic as any metronome. Roulette wheels spun with the soft hiss of polished wood and brass. Men who controlled railroads, mines, and shipping lines sat hunched over cards, their vast fortunes temporarily subordinated to the laws of probability. For Reginald, these rooms represented revelation. Here, no one bowed to his name. The dealer did not hesitate because the player was a Vanderbilt. If anything, his surname made him a target, an easy mark whom the house knew would always return with deeper pockets. He was not offended by this treatment. He was liberated by it. His marriage to Kathleen Nielsen in 1903 briefly suggested the possibility of redemption. She was beautiful, from an acceptable family, and seemed to offer the structure his life desperately lacked. The wedding was the social event of the season, a display of dynastic power cementing his status as a pillar of American society. For several months, he played the role of devoted husband with convincing sincerity, reducing his gambling, attending to his racing operations with something approaching discipline. But the fundamental architecture of his character was already set. The boredom returned, then the restlessness, then the inevitable drift back to tables where outcomes remained beautifully, dangerously uncertain. The true insidiousness of his addiction lay in the scale of his resources. For ordinary men, a bad night at the tables creates immediate consequences: missed rent payments, debts that cannot be hidden, wives who discover the truth. For Reginald, consequences were delayed, muffled by the sheer volume of his inheritance. He could lose $10,000, a fortune in 1903, and his lifestyle would not change by a single degree. The carriages still arrived, servants still bowed, champagne still flowed. This lack of immediate feedback severed the connection between action and consequence. He was bleeding out in a warm bath, unable to feel the temperature drop until hypothermia set in. By 1905, the whispers had grown more pointed. Friends described him with words carrying ominous weight: reckless, undisciplined, living beyond even his considerable means. But these warnings were delivered with smiles over brandy, in tones suggesting fond exasperation rather than genuine alarm. The gambling had become the social lubricant of his circle. To refuse a wager was to be a bore. To play high stakes was to demonstrate one's mettle. For Reginald, the poker table became the only arena where he felt he was truly testing himself against other men, a distorted form of combat for a generation that had never known war. He began keeping odd hours, sleeping until noon, living by the artificial light of chandeliers and gas lamps. The discipline of morning, the clarity of day, these belonged to working men, bankers, brothers who managed trains. Reginald belonged to the night, to the suspended time of gaming rooms where fortunes changed hands between midnight and dawn. He surrounded himself with enablers, sycophants and fellow gamblers who cheered his reckless bets and drank his expensive whiskey. They celebrated his generosity when he covered their losses and praised his boldness when he doubled down on losing hands. The mathematics of his destruction were already visible to anyone willing to calculate. His trust fund, vast as it was, generated perhaps $500,000 annually in interest and dividends. But his expenses were approaching $1 million per year, Sandy Point Farm's maintenance, the staff required for his various properties, the horses, the entertaining, the gambling losses he dismissed as the cost of the sport. He was spending principal, not just interest, slowly eroding the foundation of his fortune, while convincing himself that his wealth was too vast to ever find its shores. What made it truly dangerous was that the losses remained manageable within the context of his immense inheritance. When he lost $20,000 at baccarat, it represented perhaps 0.1% of his total wealth. The loss was real but not yet catastrophic, creating the most lethal illusion of all, that he could continue indefinitely, that his fortune was not finite, but approaching infinite, that the mathematical laws governing ordinary existence simply did not apply to a Vanderbilt. He was fighting a war against probability itself, pouring his inheritance into a void that had no bottom, while mistaking the swirling vortex for entertainment. The losses were drops in an ocean of inherited wealth, or so he believed. But the thing about oceans is that even they have shores, and Reginald was already drifting toward deeper, more dangerous waters, where currents ran swift and merciless, and where even the most powerful name in America would prove insufficient to keep a drowning man afloat. By day, society saw a genial sportsman maintaining the Vanderbilt standard with impeccable precision, a man who seemed to embody everything noble about American aristocracy. Reginald appeared at charity luncheons with a fresh carnation in his buttonhole, his smile practiced and warm, his conversation effortlessly charming. He hosted elaborate dinners where the silverware alone represented more wealth than most families would see in lifetimes, where French wines flowed like water, and where every detail reinforced the illusion of a dynasty operating at the height of its powers. He attended the opera in the family box, nodded graciously to acquaintances from his private carriage, and maintained the elaborate social machinery that defined the American aristocratic class. To the casual observer, he was the perfect embodiment of inherited privilege, handsome, affable, seemingly content to drift through life on the currents of ancestral fortune. But by night, another story was being written in red ink across the ledgers of Manhattan's most exclusive gaming establishments. As the sun descended and respectable society retired to their townhouses, Reginald emerged into a parallel world where the rules of daylight decorum dissolved into something more primal and desperate. The private gaming rooms knew him by first name, welcomed him with a particular warmth reserved for reliable patrons, and watched with professional detachment as he transformed from Vanderbilt Heir into something more dangerous and alive. Here, in the smoke-thick darkness where fortunes changed hands on whispered bets, his true self emerged, not the ornamental aristocrat of afternoon teas, but a man engaged in slow-motion suicide by 1,000 wagers. This double life was not merely a series of bad habits, but a carefully constructed architecture of deceit that required immense energy to maintain. The escalation of his ruin unfolded methodically, each year adding new layers to his financial destruction, while the public fade grew more elaborate to compensate. His marriage to Kathleen Nielsen in 1903 had promised redemption, a chance to anchor himself to something beyond the spinning roulette wheel. She was beautiful, intelligent, and came from a family that understood the particular burdens of inherited wealth. The union was hailed as a stabilizing force, the moment when the prodigal son would finally shoulder the responsibilities of his station. For brief, shining months, Reginald played the role of devoted husband with apparent sincerity. He reduced his gambling, attended to his racing operations with something approaching discipline, even spoke of starting a family and assuming the duties befitting his name. But the architecture of addiction is not so easily dismantled. The boredom crept back with the inevitability of tide, then the restlessness, then the gravitational pull toward tables, where his pulse could quicken and his existence could feel momentarily significant. Kathleen watched her husband disappear into the night with increasing frequency, returning at dawn with the hollow eyes of a man who had been somewhere she could not follow. Instead of providing stability, the marriage became merely another stage for his performance. While Kathleen attempted to manage a household and maintain the social obligations expected of a Vanderbilt wife, Reginald treated domesticity as a distraction from his true vocation, the pursuit of chance. He would leave their Newport estate for business trips that were thinly veiled excursions to Saratoga or illegal gaming parlors, returning days later with bloodshot eyes and lighter pockets, offering apologies that grew thinner with each repetition. She endured his absences with the stoicism expected of women in her position, maintaining the public fade while privately documenting his betrayals with the methodical precision of someone preparing for war. By 1912, whatever affection had existed between them had curdled into mutual resentment. The divorce proceedings were as scandalous as they were inevitable. She cited adultery and abandonment, painting a portrait of a husband who had chosen cards and horses over marital vows. When Kathleen filed for divorce, the legal filings contained words that polite society whispered but never shouted. Adultery and abandonment. In the Gilded Age, such accusations were social death sentences for ordinary men, but for a Vanderbilt they were merely expensive inconveniences. The settlement cost him $500,000, a staggering sum that could have built a library or endowed a hospital wing. Money that would have bankrupted ordinary men, but represented merely the opening act of his financial tragedy. The divorce liberated him from even the pretense of restraint. Without a wife to answer to, without the social pressure to maintain domestic respectability, Reginald plunged deeper into the only pursuits that made him feel genuinely alive. With the constraints of marriage removed, his expenses began to multiply exponentially, driven by an obsession with thoroughbred breeding that bordered on mania. His racing operation at Sandy Point Farm metastasized from gentleman's hobby into something approaching industrial madness. The farm ceased to be a pleasant diversion and transformed into a voracious beast that consumed money with terrifying efficiency. He expanded the stables until they housed over 100 horses, each requiring specialized care, training, veterinary attention, and the small army of grooms, trainers, and stable hands necessary to maintain them. He imported feed from Europe, commissioned tack from the finest leatherworkers in England, and traveled with an entourage that rivaled a royal court. The overhead alone approached $500,000 annually before a single horse entered a single race, money spent not on productive investments, but on the elaborate theater of sporting respectability. But even this staggering expenditure paled beside his actual racing losses. Between 1903 and 1920, Reginald lost over $5 million at tracks from Saratoga to Churchill Downs, sums that defied comprehension and represented not the careful wagers of a knowledgeable horseman, but the desperate bets of a man trying to fill a void that no amount of winning could satisfy. The psychology deepening beneath this behavior was more complex and tragic than simple vice. Reginald did not treat his vast inheritance as capital to preserve or invest wisely. He treated it as inexhaustible fuel for pleasure, a resource as limitless as the ocean itself. He suffered from a delusion common to those born into the stratosphere of wealth, the belief that money was a natural feature of the landscape, like a mountain or a river, permanent and self-renewing. This was not entirely his fault. He had been raised in a world where money appeared magically, where fortunes seemed to regenerate themselves without effort or discipline. The Commodore's brutal work ethic, the 14-hour days, and ruthless calculations that had built the empire had been completely erased from family memory within 2 generations. The knowledge that he could afford to lose became precisely what made the losing inevitable. A working man who loses his week's wages at poker feels immediate, visceral consequences. His family goes hungry. His rent goes unpaid. Reality intrudes with brutal clarity. But Reginald could lose $50,000 and still wake in silk sheets, still be served breakfast by liveried servants, still find his wardrobe impeccably maintained. The absence of immediate feedback severed the natural connection between action and consequence. He was like a man who had disabled his pain receptors, capable of placing his hand in fire without feeling the burn until his flesh was already destroyed. His gambling was not vice in the conventional sense. To him, it felt like breathing, like sport, like destiny itself. At the card table, he was not a passive heir living off ancestral achievements, but an active participant in his own story. The turn of a card, the spin of a wheel, the photo finish at the track, these moments contained genuine uncertainty, the only uncertainty his privileged life afforded. He was addicted not to winning, but to the sensation of not knowing, to those precious seconds when even his surname could not predetermine the outcome. In a life that had been scripted from birth, gambling offered improvisation. In a world that bowed to his name, chance remained gloriously indifferent. The social consequences emerged gradually, like cracks spreading through fine porcelain. At first, the whispers in private clubs, the Union, the Knickerbocker, the Brook, carried tones of amused indulgence. "Reggie does enjoy his cards," they would say, smiling into their brandy. "The boy has a taste for excitement." But as the years accumulated and the losses mounted, the language shifted imperceptibly but unmistakably. Men who had once clamored to sit at his table now found excuses to drift away when he approached, wary of the frantic energy he radiated. "He plays too long," someone noted at the Union Club. "Too often," added another. "There's something in his eyes that troubles me, not the look of a man enjoying sport, but of a man fleeing something he cannot name." The transition from Gilded Age formality to Jazz Age frenzy only accelerated his descent. The old rules that had governed his youth, the elaborate codes of conduct, the pretense of restraint, the fiction that wealthy men were somehow more disciplined than their inferiors, dissolved in the cultural upheaval following the Great War. While millions confronted mortality in trenches, he confronted probability at card tables. His battles fought not over territory or ideals, but over piles of colored chips. The new generation that emerged from the war had no patience for Victorian hypocrisy. They wanted pleasure, immediacy, sensation. Prohibition transformed drinking from social ritual into rebellious act, and the speakeasies that flourished in its wake offered perfect cover for gambling operations that had previously required nominal discretion. The bankers were less circumspect in their private correspondence. Discreet letters began arriving at his various residences, their language carefully calibrated to express concern without giving offense. "We note with some alarm that your account has been overdrawn for the third consecutive month," one letter began, typed on heavy bond paper and sealed with wax. "While we understand that your assets are substantial, we must respectfully suggest that your current rate of expenditure is not sustainable, even given your considerable resources." These warnings spoke of liquidity concerns, of overdrawn accounts, of the need to rebalance the portfolio. For a decade, Reginald ignored them with aristocratic disdain, treating them as impertinent interruptions to the serious business of leisure. The paradox at the heart of his destruction was almost philosophical in its cruelty. He was a man born into a dynasty that regarded its wealth as supernatural in durability, that treated fortune as a permanent condition rather than a temporary state requiring constant vigilance. The Vanderbilt name had, for decades, appeared in the public imagination as synonymous with inexhaustibility. Yet every signature he scrawled across a betting slip, every marker he called in at 3 a.m, every impulse purchase of another thoroughbred, each of these actions chipped away at those ancestral stones with the patience of water-eroding granite. The fortune that had seemed infinite was revealing itself to be merely very large, and very large is not the same as inexhaustible. By 1920, the properties began to go quietly at first. A townhouse here, a yacht there, assets liquidated to cover debts that had accumulated with compound interest over 2 decades of excess. Each sale was presented as streamlining or focusing his interests, but those who understood mathematics recognized these transactions for what they were. the systematic dismantling of a fortune that had seemed too vast to ever find its limits. The man who believed he could outrun the mathematics of ruin was about to discover that even the mightiest names are subject to the cold arithmetic of consequence. From the outside, the Vanderbilt name still commanded reverence. The carriages still arrived, the invitations still came, and the society columns still chronicled his movements with breathless attention. But beneath the polished surface, the numbers had begun to whisper a single undeniable truth. Even infinity has limits, and Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt was about to learn that the ocean of his inheritance did indeed have shores, and beyond those shores lay only darkness and the merciless mathematics of ruin. $70 million. In 1915, when Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt inherited the bulk of his father's estate following Cornelius II's death, the sum represented wealth beyond ordinary human comprehension, enough to live like an emperor for 1,000 lifetimes, enough to endow universities or build entire cities from. Nothing. We return now to that rain-soaked chamber at Sandy Point Farm, but the warm golden light of his privileged youth has been replaced by something colder, more clinical, the harsh blue illumination of a man facing the mathematical consequences of his choices. He destroyed that vast inheritance in exactly 3,650 days, 10 years of systematic financial suicide executed with terrifying precision. The brutal arithmetic of his ruin reveals not chaos but methodology, a relentless dedication to consumption that bordered on the pathological. Reginald spent an average of $19,000 per day, every single day, for 10 consecutive years. To comprehend this velocity of destruction requires understanding that he awoke each morning, having already spent more than most skilled American workers earned in an entire decade. In an era when the average family survived on less than $1,500 annually, Reginald was burning through 13 years of a working man's salary before his morning coffee had cooled. But he was not purchasing assets that would endure or appreciate. He was buying experiences that evaporated the moment they concluded, leaving nothing behind but fading memories and mounting debts. The overhead alone consumed his fortune with mechanical efficiency. Before a single dollar touched gambling tables or entertainment, his lifestyle demanded approximately $2 million annually, simply to maintain the illusion of Vanderbilt grandeur. He employed over 100 people across his various estates: butlers, maids, cooks, grooms, gardeners, chauffeurs, secretaries, and the specialized servants whose sole purpose was maintaining the elaborate machinery of aristocratic existence. Property scattered across multiple states: the Fifth Avenue Mansion, Sandy Point Farm, the Newport Cottage, apartments maintained for convenience in cities he rarely visited. Each required permanent staff, constant maintenance, insurance premiums, and the thousand small expenses that transform real estate from asset into liability. These properties were not investments, but monuments to his pathology. He owned yachts whose polished decks required constant maintenance by crews who waited endlessly for an owner who never appeared. He purchased automobiles, the finest European engineering could produce, and left them in climate-controlled garages, driven perhaps once before being forgotten in favor of the next acquisition. Each yacht required captains and crews. Each automobile demanded mechanics and storage. Each property consumed armies of servants. The mathematical precision of this destruction was almost elegant. He had created a perpetual motion machine of wealth consumption that operated with industrial efficiency, converting capital into overhead with the reliability of a steam engine. But it was the gambling that transformed decline into freefall, overhead into catastrophe. The stories of his losses became legendary whispers in clubs from Monte Carlo to Manhattan. In 1920, during one apocalyptic weekend at the baccarat tables of Monte Carlo, Reginald methodically lost $1.2 million in approximately 48 hours of continuous play. The mathematics are staggering: $25,000 per hour, over $400 per minute, nearly $7 vanishing with every tick of the clock. Yet the true horror lay not in the loss itself, but in what followed. A rational man, even a wealthy one, would have recoiled from such devastation. Reginald returned the following night, sat at the same table, ordered the same champagne, and proceeded to lose another fortune with the calm detachment of a man who believed his inheritance had no bottom. His second marriage in 1923 to 19-year-old Gloria Morgan accelerated rather than curbed his spending, transforming his final years into a frantic performance of wealth he no longer possessed. Desperate to maintain the illusion of Vanderbilt grandeur for his young bride, he engaged in increasingly elaborate displays of affluence. He showered her with jewels purchased on credit, took her on European tours that drained his remaining liquidity, and hosted parties that grew more lavish as his bank accounts grew emptier. It was a terrifying pantomime, a man dancing on the precipice of ruin, smiling brilliantly to convince his audience, and perhaps himself, that the ground beneath his feet remained solid. By 1924, the fade began to crumble publicly, and the dismantling of the Vanderbilt empire became a spectacle for newspaper readers across America. The mansions were quietly listed, then not so quietly auctioned. Headlines tracked his descent with the fascination typically reserved for natural disasters. Vanderbilt sells Fifth Avenue mansion, Sandy Point Farm contents to be auctioned, Reginald Vanderbilt liquidates racing stable. Each headline represented not merely a transaction, but the systematic conversion of a dynasty into currency that would be spent and forgotten within months. Sandy Point Farm, that elaborate monument to his obsession with thoroughbred racing, went to auction in a scene of almost operatic tragedy. The horses, those magnificent animals whose bloodlines he had studied with more care than he ever applied to his own finances, were dispersed to new owners who purchased them for fractions of their original cost. The stables that had housed over 100 thoroughbreds stood empty, the elaborate training facilities silent. Decades of racing dreams dissolved into the merciless arithmetic of insolvency. Cars were repossessed by creditors whose patience had finally expired. Yachts sold at distressed prices to men who would actually use them. The ledger books tell the story with devastating clarity, columns of red ink stretching down pages like bloodstains, recording debts to jewelers, tailors, florists, and most damningly, to fellow gamblers. The honor debts, gambling losses that had to be settled immediately to preserve social standing, took precedence over mortgages, taxes, and even family obligations. He was cannibalizing his future to pay for his past, robbing the very assets that sustained his lifestyle to cover the costs of maintaining the illusion of that lifestyle. It was a closed loop of destruction, mathematical and inexorable. The final crushing irony arrived in February 1924 when Gloria Morgan gave birth to their daughter, also named Gloria. In a scene of unbearable pathos, Reginald held the infant in the library of a house he technically no longer owned, the deed having been quietly transferred to creditors weeks earlier. The walls were lined with books he would never read, surrounded by furniture that would soon be auctioned to satisfy his debts. Looking down at the child who would bear his name but inherit only the wreckage of his choices, he reportedly whispered 2 words that broke through a lifetime of denial. "I'm sorry." It was perhaps his only moment of genuine clarity, an acknowledgement that he had failed in the most fundamental duty of a patriarch, to preserve the legacy for future generations. As his body surrendered to decades of abuse, his liver destroyed by the finest whiskeys money could buy, his heart weakened by the relentless stress of concealed ruin, the creditors began to gather like carrion birds sensing death. They waited in hallways, consulted with lawyers in hushed tones, and prepared their claims against the estate before the body was even cold. The man dying in that rain-soaked bed was no longer a titan of industry or prince of society, but an insolvent debtor, a biological organism failing in perfect synchronization with his financial portfolio. The mathematical precision of his financial suicide was almost artistic in its completeness. Nothing had been stolen from him, there was no swindle to blame, no external villain to shoulder responsibility. Every check had been written by his hand, every bet placed by his will, every reckless purchase another variable in an equation whose only possible solution was zero. The numbers did not rage or accuse. They merely recorded, with perfect indifference, the systematic evaporation of a dynasty built on discipline and transformed into a cautionary tale about the mathematics of ruin. When his heart finally stilled at 3:17 am on September 4, 1925, the silence in the room was absolute. The man was gone, his suffering concluded, but the wreckage he left behind would trigger the most scandalous custody battle in American history, proving that some fortunes destroy not just the heir, but generations yet unborn. In the nursery, 18-month-old Gloria slept peacefully, unaware that she had just inherited not a dynasty, but a lawsuit, not security, but scandal, not the American dream, but its most public nightmare. The Vanderbilt name would survive, but it would carry forever the stain of a man who had proven that even the mightiest fortunes are mortal, and that the distance between American royalty and American tragedy can be measured not in miles but in choices, each signature, each bet, each moment of weakness leading inexorably toward the mathematical certainty of ruin. Reginald's death should have been a private family tragedy, mourned quietly behind the marble walls of Fifth Avenue mansions, resolved with the dignified efficiency that wealth typically affords to America's aristocratic families. Instead, it became a public spectacle that exposed the rot at the heart of America's most celebrated dynasty, transforming what should have been a funeral into a financial autopsy conducted in newspaper headlines across the nation. The moment his heart stopped beating at 3:17 in that rain-soaked morning, the fragile ecosystem of debt and deception he had constructed for a decade collapsed instantly, revealing not the expected empire, but a financial wasteland where $70 million had once stood. The immediate aftermath revealed the staggering scope of destruction to a shocked public. His widow, 21-year-old Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, discovered she had inherited not a kingdom, but a crater. The vast fortune Reginald had controlled, the real estate portfolios, the racing stables, the art collections, the yachts and automobiles that had symbolized Vanderbilt's supremacy, had been utterly consumed by debt. When the accountants finished their grim tally in the autumn of 1925, the estate was not merely diminished, but actively insolvent. Creditors who had waited with predatory patience while he lived descended upon the wreckage with legal writs and auction notices, their claims exceeding the remaining assets by millions. Gloria Morgan, the girl who had married a Vanderbilt believing she had secured a future of limitless luxury, found herself essentially destitute, dependent on the charity of relatives who viewed her with suspicion and barely concealed disdain. But buried within this financial catastrophe lay one surviving fragment of the Vanderbilt fortune, a trust fund established for their infant daughter, also named Gloria. Valued at $2.5 million, roughly equivalent to $40 million in today's currency, it represented the only assets Reginald had been unable to gamble away or mortgage, protected by ironclad legal covenants established by his father Cornelius II, who had perhaps anticipated, if not the scale, then at least the possibility of such destruction. This trust fund became both salvation and curse, the singular object of desire and conflict around which the family would completely shatter. The cruel irony was inescapable. The child who could not yet speak had become the wealthiest member of her family, a living, breathing bank account for whoever possessed her. For 7 years, from 1925 to 1932, an uneasy peace prevailed. Gloria Morgan traveled Europe with her daughter in tow, living entirely on the allowance provided from the child's trust, a nomadic, unstable existence that moved between hotels in Paris, villas in Cannes, and borrowed apartments in London. It was a lifestyle funded entirely by the wealth of a child who barely understood her own name, let alone the source of the luxuries surrounding her. The mother, desperate to maintain the social position she believed marriage had guaranteed her, drifted through the expatriate circles of the Jazz Age, surrounding herself with titled Europeans and artistic pretenders, while her daughter was raised by an ever-changing succession of nurses and governesses. Young Gloria became a lonely observer of her mother's frantic social climbing, a silent witness to the gradual erosion of whatever maternal instincts Gloria Morgan might once have possessed. The explosion, when it came, shattered the remaining pretense of family unity with devastating finality. In 1932, Reginald's sister, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, stepped forward to do something almost unthinkable in that hermetic world of old money discretion. She made private scandal public. Gertrude was everything her brother had not been: disciplined, purposeful, a sculptor and patron of the arts who had transformed her inheritance into lasting cultural institutions rather than dissipating it in smoke-filled rooms. She was the founder of what would become the Whitney Museum of American Art, a woman who understood that wealth carried obligations beyond mere pleasure. She had watched her brother's descent with horror, powerless to intervene while he lived, but determined to rescue his daughter from repeating the cycle of destruction that seemed to curse their generation. The petition she filed for guardianship of 10-year-old Gloria was devastating in its specificity, cataloging Gloria Morgan's failures with prosecutorial precision. The neglect, the inappropriate companions, the alcoholism that had become increasingly difficult to conceal, the financial mismanagement that threatened to squander even the protected trust. With that single legal document, she dragged one of America's most powerful names into open court and invited the world to witness the dismantling of a dynasty. The trial that followed became what newspapers breathlessly christened the trial of the century, a designation that revealed more about American fascination with fallen aristocracy than about the legal proceedings themselves. For months, the custody battle dominated front pages, pushing aside economic depression and international crisis to focus on the intimate dysfunction of America's most famous family. The Vanderbilt name, which for decades had been synonymous with elegance, power, and the triumph of American capitalism, now evoked something darker: scandal, dysfunction, and the inherited tragedy that wealth could not prevent and often accelerated. The courtroom became a theater of cruelty, where former servants testified about their employers' failings, with the detailed recall of those who had been watching carefully, perhaps anticipating this moment. Maids described finding Gloria Morgan unconscious from drink, while young Gloria wandered the halls alone. Nannies recounted being dismissed without pay when they objected to the child's treatment. Former friends, their loyalty dissolved by the acid of scandal, testified about wild parties where the child was present, about Gloria Morgan's numerous affairs conducted with shocking indiscretion, about a lifestyle that prioritized pleasure over maternal responsibility with sociopathic consistency. A French maid, dressed now in modest American attire, described late-night visitors slipping into hotel suites after the child had been put to bed. A former nurse testified that the girl had been left for long stretches in the care of staff, while her mother pursued what she delicately termed amusements across Europe. The most devastating testimony, however, came from young Gloria herself, forced at 10 years old to testify against her own mother in proceedings she could not fully comprehend. The judge, attempting to shield the child from the public gallery, cleared the courtroom, but the details leaked almost instantly to a press corps that had transformed the trial into the most lucrative story of the decade. Led gently by attorneys into the judge's chambers, away from the spectators, but not from the transcripts that would be published in every newspaper in America, she was asked the question the entire nation was straining to hear. Did she fear her mother? The room fell into a hush so complete that every breath seemed an intrusion. Gloria looked down, then up, then finally at the man in robes who held her fate between his fingers. "Yes," she whispered, barely audible, and with that single syllable, the trial was no longer an abstract legal argument, but something rawer and more disturbing, a child appealing for rescue from her own mother under the gaze of millions. The verdict, when it came, was devastating in its simplicity and finality. The court ruled decisively in Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's favor, granting her custody and control of the trust that would sustain young Gloria until adulthood. Gloria Morgan was stripped of custody, allowed only limited visitation rights that were strictly monitored and could be revoked at any time. The decision was presented as protecting the child's welfare, but it was also an indictment of everything Gloria Morgan represented: the shallow, pleasure-seeking culture that had destroyed Reginald and now threatened to consume his daughter. The judge, with the cold authority of the state, effectively declared that the bloodline that had squandered its fortune could not be trusted to guide the last of its heirs. While the legal battle raged in courtrooms, the physical dismantling of Reginald's empire continued with ruthless efficiency in auction houses and estate sales across the Northeast. Sandy Point Farm, that elaborate monument to his obsession with thoroughbred racing, was emptied room by room. Auctioneers moved through spaces where he had entertained presidents and kings, tagging furniture with lot numbers, rolling up Persian carpets, and placing price estimates on family heirlooms that had once been considered priceless. Strangers wandered through the halls where Vanderbilt children had played, bidding on the silverware he had eaten from, the paintings he had admired, the very bed where he had drawn his final breath. The horses were long gone, sold to cover immediate debts, and the elaborate stables stood empty, their silence a monument to dreams that had died with their dreamer. The mansion itself eventually fell into disrepair, a ghost ship stranded on the Rhode Island coast, its boarded windows and overgrown gardens serving as a physical manifestation of a dynasty in full retreat. The generational impact of this trauma would reverberate through the decades like aftershocks from an earthquake, each successive generation bearing the scars of Reginald's choices. Young Gloria grew up forever marked as the poor little rich girl, a phrase that followed her through adolescence and into adulthood like a curse she could neither escape nor fully embrace. She sought throughout her life the stability her father had never provided and her mother had been unable to give, marrying 4 times in search of the security she craved. Each marriage, to a Hollywood agent, to a conductor, to a director, to a writer, represented not just romantic choice, but an attempt to anchor herself to something solid, to find in partnership what inheritance had failed to provide. She reinvented herself repeatedly, transforming from victim into survivor, from scandal into success. She became an artist, an actress, a writer, and finally, most successfully, a fashion designer who put her famous name on denim jeans, transforming the symbol of American aristocracy into a brand accessible to the masses. It was perhaps the ultimate act of reclaiming her identity, taking the name that had been a burden and turning it into an asset she controlled, democratizing the Vanderbilt legacy in a way her grandfather never could have imagined. Her son, Anderson Cooper, would inherit this complex legacy in its most refined form. He grew up hearing stories not of Vanderbilt triumphs but of Vanderbilt tragedies, understanding from a young age that the famous fortune was gone, dissipated by Reginald's generation, consumed by lawyers, eroded by time and the inexorable mathematics of compound spending. He inherited not the Vanderbilt millions because there were no millions left to inherit, but the family's complex history of public scrutiny and private pain, the knowledge that great names carry great burdens, and that wealth without purpose corrodes everything it touches. His career as a journalist, seeking truth in war zones and disaster areas, seemed a direct repudiation of the ornamental, purposeless life his great-grandfather Reginald had led. Where Reginald had fled from reality into the fantasy of gambling, Anderson Cooper ran toward reality, documenting the world's harshest truths with the unflinching gaze of someone who had seen how quickly illusions dissolve. In interviews, he would speak of his determination not to leave his own children vast inheritances, having witnessed firsthand through family history how unearned wealth could poison rather than nourish, could destroy rather than sustain. The fortune that took 3 generations to build, the Commodore's brutal accumulation through steamships and railroads, Cornelius' careful expansion into industrial monopoly, and the collective efforts of dozens of shrewd business managers was dismantled in a courtroom in less than 2 years. of legal proceedings that valued assets, satisfied creditors, and distributed what little remained. The mathematical precision of this dissolution mirrored the mathematical precision of Reginald's destruction. Both were exercises in converting something substantial into nothing, in transforming dynasty into memory, in proving that even the mightiest names are subject to the laws of entropy and consequence. But the most haunting question remained, whispered in the halls of clubs where Reginald had once gambled away fortunes, debated in drawing rooms where his memory was invoked as warning rather than inspiration. Was Reginald Vanderbilt a victim of his circumstances, or the architect of his own? Destruction? The answer, like most profound truths, contained elements of both tragedy and choice, of systemic failure and personal responsibility. He was born into a world that gave him everything except purpose, that provided infinite means but no meaningful ends, that trained him for a role that no longer existed in an America rapidly transforming beyond the Gilded Age fantasies of his youth. Yet, he was also a man who made choices, who signed checks and placed bets and ignored warnings, who chose pleasure over responsibility with such consistency that it became not weakness but policy, not accident but architecture. Today, the Vanderbilt mansions stand as monuments to a vanished world, preserved not by descendants but by historical societies that maintain them as museums to American ambition and its inevitable collapse. The Breakers in Newport, that 70-room testament to Gilded Age supremacy where young Reginald once played with the careless confidence of immortality, now welcomes over 400,000 visitors annually. They photograph ceilings painted by European masters, marvel at dining rooms where single meals cost more than working families earned in years, and purchase souvenirs from gift shops, utterly unaware that the small boy who once ran through these marble halls would grow up to destroy everything. His family had built. Not a single property remains in family hands. Every mansion, every estate, every physical manifestation of Vanderbilt power has been sold, donated, or seized by creditors, transformed from private palaces into public spectacles where democracy now walks freely through spaces once reserved for American royalty. In Staten Island, the Vanderbilt Mausoleum sits in guarded seclusion, a massive structure of granite and bronze designed to project permanence into eternity. Among these vaults of iron and stone, Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt lies largely forgotten, his name carved with the same elegant script as his ancestors, as if death had somehow equalized his contribution to the family legacy. But death does not equalize. It merely concludes. The stone remembers all their names with equal indifference, yet history judges them with brutal specificity. He rests not as a builder like his great-grandfather, but as a cautionary tale etched in cold marble, visited by few, remembered primarily for what he squandered rather than what he achieved. The tragedy of the Vanderbilt dynasty reveals itself most clearly when we trace the arc from creation to destruction across just 3 generations. The Commodore built his empire through deprivation and discipline that bordered on the pathological, working 14-hour days well into his 70s, his mind operating with the precision of the railroad timetables he mastered. He understood that wealth was not a static possession, but a dynamic force requiring constant vigilance and ruthless decision-making. He eliminated uncertainty from transportation and commerce through sheer force of will, spending a lifetime removing chance from the equation of his existence, creating systems so efficient and dominant that competitors had no choice but to sell or be destroyed. His great-grandson inherited the fruits of that brutal mastery, but chose to dwell precisely in the realm his ancestor had spent a lifetime eliminating: uncertainty. The roll of dice, the outcome of races, the shuffle of cards, these were the domains where Reginald felt most alive, where his vast resources could not predetermine results, where he was stripped of the Vanderbilt armor and forced to face chance as an equal. It was a perverse inversion of everything the Commodore had valued, a generational conversation conducted in the language of capital, with Reginald's answer to his ancestors' discipline being a decade-long exercise in systematic destruction. The deeper truth that emerges from this trajectory is that Reginald was born into a system that gave him everything except the one thing that might have saved him: purpose. He inherited wealth without responsibility, a fortune so vast that he could live like royalty without ever producing anything of value. He possessed status without obligation, his name opening every door yet requiring nothing from him except that he exist as its living embodiment. He enjoyed freedom without consequence, or so he believed, until the consequences arrived all at once in the form of creditors, divorces, and finally death itself. Reginald became what we might call a biological engine for spending money, a role he performed with tragic efficiency until the fuel ran out. He was a ghost haunting his own life, a man who required constant stimulation to feel alive because he possessed no internal source of meaning. In a world where every outcome was guaranteed by his surname, gambling offered the only authentic experience available: the possibility of failure. He was buying the sensation of risk with money that had been generated by the elimination of risk, a cosmic joke played out on green felt tables across 2 continents. This curse of inherited privilege is not unique to the Vanderbilts, but represents a universal pattern that has repeated itself across cultures and centuries. The first generation builds through deprivation and discipline. The second generation maintains through careful stewardship. And the third generation destroys through ignorance, entitlement, or the simple inability to comprehend that wealth is not a permanent condition, but a temporary state, requiring constant effort to sustain. Reginald was not an aberration, but an archetype, the inevitable endpoint of a system that confused inheritance with immortality, that treated fortune as supernatural in durability when it was merely very large. And very large is not the same as inexhaustible. Easy money does not merely soften the will, it distorts reality itself. It teaches that effort is optional, that limits are suggestions, that problems will evaporate if ignored long enough. It whispers the seductive lie that the rules binding other people do not apply to you. For Reginald, this delusion proved fatal. He believed his wealth was infinite because he had never experienced its limits, never felt the natural resistance that teaches ordinary mortals the value of restraint. The modern connection to this historical tragedy crystallizes most powerfully through Anderson Cooper, Reginald's great-grandson, who has spoken with remarkable candor about the family's complex legacy and his determination not to repeat its mistakes. Cooper has stated explicitly that he will not leave his children a significant inheritance, explaining his philosophy with words that would have been incomprehensible to his Gilded Age ancestors. "I don't believe in passing on huge amounts of money. I think it's a curse. My dad grew up really poor, and I think he didn't want me to be spoiled." These words represent a complete philosophical rejection of the system that created and destroyed Reginald, an acknowledgement that wealth without earned purpose corrodes character rather than building it. Cooper's career as a journalist, documenting conflicts and disasters in the world's most dangerous places, seems almost deliberately constructed as the antithesis of Reginald's ornamental existence. Where his great-grandfather fled from reality into fantasy worlds of gambling and aristocratic leisure, Cooper runs toward reality with the unflinching determination of someone who understands that purpose must be earned rather than inherited. What emerges from the Vanderbilt saga transcends the specifics of one family's rise and fall to touch something fundamental about human nature and the relationship between wealth and character. Wealth can insulate against many of life's hardships. It can purchase comfort, access, opportunity, and time, but it cannot replace character. It cannot instill discipline in those who have never known deprivation, cannot teach the value of work to those who have never needed to labor, cannot create purpose in lives where every material need is satisfied before it is even articulated. Dynasties can pass down estates, titles, and bank accounts, but they cannot always pass down the discipline required to preserve them. Character does not travel reliably through bloodlines. It must be cultivated anew in each generation, often under conditions that great wealth makes difficult, if not impossible, to replicate. Time has no reverence for surnames, no respect for pedigree or historical achievement. It erodes both stone and reputation with the same indifferent patience, grinding down monuments and memories alike until even the mightiest names become footnotes in history books, curiosities for tourists photographing museum rooms. Reginald Vanderbilt proved that a name can open any door in the world, the most exclusive clubs, the finest tables, the company of presidents and princes, but it cannot keep the demons out. His demons were not external, but internal, the boredom that comes from purposeless existence, the desperate need to feel something in a life cushioned against all discomfort, the addiction to risk that filled the void where meaning should have resided. He spent a lifetime trying to purchase happiness, surrounding himself with every luxury civilization could produce, yet discovered that the price was his very soul. Happiness cannot be bought because it is not a commodity, but a byproduct of purpose, connection, and the sense that one's existence matters beyond mere consumption. In the end, he stands as a reminder of a simpler, harsher law that operates with the inevitability of gravity. Nothing is too grand to lose, no fortune too vast to squander, and no dynasty too mighty to fall. The mansions crumble, the fortunes evaporate, the names fade from memory until they exist only in historical records and museum placards. The Commodore's empire, which once controlled 10% of America's currency and seemed as permanent as the railroads themselves, was reduced to nothing in less than a century, destroyed not by external enemies, but by the internal contradictions of inherited privilege. The house always wins. This truth applies not just to casinos, but to life itself. Every bet Reginald placed, whether at the racetrack or the card table, was made against a house that had infinite patience and perfect memory, that could afford to lose 1,000 times, because it knew it would eventually reclaim everything. And time, patient and inexorable, always collects its debt. It collected from Reginald at 317 and on that rain-soaked morning in 1925, taking not just his life, but his fortune, his reputation, and his family's dynasty. The roulette ball that spun through Reginald's life has finally come to rest, settling into its slot with the finality of a closing chapter. The number it landed on was 0, the house number, the one that pays nothing to the player and returns everything to the institution. And in that 0, in that void where $70 million once existed, lies the ultimate lesson of the Vanderbilt paradox, that wealth without purpose is merely a countdown to nothing, that privilege without responsibility is a curse disguised as blessing, and that the true measure of a life is not what we inherit, but what we build, not what we possess, but what we become, not the fortune we leave behind, but the character we develop in the brief, uncertain span between birth and the final, inevitable reckoning.